Welcome everyone to another Fantasy Fellowship Author Q&A video. Today I have with me the author of one of my top reads of the year so far and has caused quite a stir with some very pretty broken binding editions that have just come out. That book is The Judas Blossom. And a big welcome to the author, Stephen Aryan.
Hello, thanks for having me.
No problem at all. So I was fortunate enough, thanks to Angry Robot Books, to get an arc of this book earlier in the year. I have it here, like I just shown it. So even the art's a very, very pretty book. And as I said, Broken Binding have just released some very, very nice editions. So yeah, I've got that one on the way.
Of course.
Yeah, of course, couldn't miss out on that. Couldn't get the lettered one, but I managed to get one of the numbered ones.
They went in like seconds, I think, basically.
Yeah.
I'm lucky I'm getting one, to be honest. So, at this point,
I mean, I'd expect it. So the Judas Blossom is set towards the end of the Mongol Empire. It follows the journey of four key characters: Haluga Khan, who is a great ruler in the Mongol Empire, and strives to follow in his grandfather's footsteps, Genghis Khan, and extend the Mongol Empire to encompass the entire world. You have Temujin, son to Haluga Khan, who is failing in his efforts to prove himself to his father, as well as come to terms with some very challenging, powerful events, to avoid spoilers, events in his life. The Blue Princess, Kokochin, is enslaved to Haluga and is trying to find her own path and power in the Mongol Empire as well. And last but certainly not least, one of my favorite characters is Kayvon, a Persian rebel who's thirsty for revenge, and it takes an interesting journey, I think, in the book. So historical fiction, dash of mystery and magic. So our first quote is predominantly set in Persia. 1260, I think, was the date.
Yes.
And the ever-present Mongol Empire is there. What made you want to write a book that was centered around a part of the world that has such a rich history?
Partly because of my Persian heritage. My dad's from Iran. I was born in Iran. So it's been a part of my life forever, really. I haven't been there in over 40 years, so obviously things have changed since, but I've always been fascinated with that part of the world for a long time. And over the last probably 10, maybe 15 years, fantasy fiction has changed. They've had more non-European-ish fantasy settings in books that have been very popular and that have become more attractive to some readers, because I still read, lots of fantasy, and I still enjoy some of the slightly more traditional things, but I sometimes want something very, very different. And this seemed like a good challenge for me, something very, very different, to mix fantasy and fiction together. I already was reading some stuff around this part of the world just for myself. I'd watched something like Marco Polo, which is set in the same era, but a completely different part of the world. And it focuses on Kublai Khan and obviously focuses on him. Whereas in this story, I'm predominantly focusing on the people who are being invaded, repressed, murdered, and bludgeoned and so on. And so it's a case of seeing it from the other perspective, but also from a part of the world that a lot of people won't know a lot about. So for them, it'll feel like a pure fantasy series in some ways, because they won't know about the culture and the customs and the people there, because it's not part of their everyday kind of life that they know about these things. Where so it's lots of different things came together, and I thought now's a good time, and I think the market would be interested in something like that as well, and readers would be happy to see something from a very kind of different perspective in a different part of the world. So yeah, just it'd been ticking around in my brain for a while, and it sort of came together, and I pitched it to my agent and my editor, and they're both very interested and excited by it. So away we go, on with a trilogy.
That's very good. Yeah. It's great that it's a trilogy. That's really, I didn't know about your background, which is interesting. Yeah, with the setting of the book. I did study Iran a few years ago, and yeah, the history is incredible when you really get into it. The history behind the country,
thousands and thousands of years you go back.
Yeah.
It's phenomenal, the amount of information that's there. And yeah, there's so much culture and history and art and poetry and architecture and ruins and all sorts of stuff that are thousands of years old. It's just incredible to see.
Yeah, I think the last book I was seeing, if it was on the shelf in front of me, but it's not. I think Empire of the Mind was the last book I read on. I don't know if you heard of Empire of the Mind, but yeah, that was quite. It was it's very compressed history of Iran, but it's right from beginning to end. So it's really interesting take. So Sort of a follow-on question, I guess, from where the book's set is, what prompted you to set the book at the outbreak of the Burqa-Haluga War? Previous books about that period of Mongols, like the Golden Series, they kind of look at the founding, the expansion. Why did you choose to look at the downfall?
Everybody kind of tends to focus on Genghis Khan, I think, and he's the most well-known, and he's the most famous, I would say, of the Mongol rulers, just in a general sense. People have heard the name if they don't know anything about him. And I thought it would be interesting to look at a period that is, as you say, a bit later. It's kind of 80 years on from when Genghis Khan has invaded some of the places. And in the period the book is now set, the empire has become so vast and so across, world covering a large portion of the world, that they've effectively broken it into 4 portions in an attempt to rule it better, because they couldn't rule it with just one. It is coming apart at the seams even before the story starts, hence why there's 4 Khanates. And because I wanted to focus it just on Persia, it seemed like the right era to set it in. But the other thing is, it's such a massively complicated period of history anyway, so focusing on just one of the 4 Khanates was going to be a real challenge. And so I thought, well, okay, well, no one's done stories around Persia. People have done things about Kublai Khan before. I haven't seen much about the Golden Horde or the Chagatai Khanate. And I thought this would be a good one to do it in, because we're slightly closer to Europe. We have some ties to Europe in the story. The era does, like the fact that a number of the Khans wrote, like the King of France and the Pope, and said, you're going to come to my court and you're going to surrender and you're going to bow down because I'm going to rule the world. And that's how it is. And the Pope is there like, I beg your pardon? And there's the Crusades, the next crusade that came up during this era. There's the Mamluks in Egypt. So it's a very rich area with a lot of stories that people won't know a bit about or anything about. And I just thought it'd be a really fascinating thing to focus on. And the difficulty is containing the story, because there's so much going on, trying to compress the story as well, because I've had to change certain things to make the story work, because history isn't a straight line, and wars will go on for years of time, and I can't just have a war start and then just skip to the end and then carry on the story 4 years later. People would want to know, well, what happened in those 4 years? And I can't do that in a very good way. So it required some manipulation, I would say, of historic facts and dates mostly.
I think I'm just going to check my art, but I think you put a historical note in the front, didn't you? Pretty much saying that you manipulate dates a lot.
I basically said I had to, because there's so much going on. I mean, where there's gaps, I can exploit that, because we don't know certain things, and that's where you can tell interesting stories, and no one can say, well, technically it's not true. And my response is, look at the spine, it says fiction.
That's right. I think people would be surprised by the amount of actual, historically accurate stuff that happens. Like you said, I think people look at it and go, oh, it's a lot of fiction in there, but actually there's a lot of incredible things, let's say, rather than the fiction.
All of the main tentpole events in the book are based upon historic fact. The invasion, the sieges that you've read, some of the other events, it all happened. Even some of how some of the event happened is real. It sounds ridiculous, but it was true. All I've done is moved some of the dates and some of the people who are involved, so it fits within the framework that I've set of these 4 kind of main points of view. There is some fictional stuff in there, like I talk about in this historical note at the front. I talk about the House of Strength. There's something else in the book that I've created that made sense to me that's completely fiction, but it feels real because of what the other thing that's fact. And so unless you know that period of history, you won't be able to see the seams and the joins. And that's my hope. Apart from historians, they can just read the story and enjoy it, and they won't be like, oh, that's not true, and that's true, and that's not true. It's just enjoy the story, enjoy the ride,
Well, funnily enough, our next question, so this is from Nessa, one of our members. So she actually wanted to know about the historical sources, primary and secondary sources that you read or used while you were researching for the book.
So I do have a stack of books behind me on my shelf. You can't see that they're behind there, that I used for some of the research. I did read the Travels of Marco Polo, who was not nearly a nice character as people think. He's quite a racist, but anyway, that's part of the era that he was living in.
Yeah, absolutely.
I've read some of the John Mann books about the Mongols, and on purpose I've forgotten certain things, or I've omitted certain things, because there are so many terms. If you've read anything about this, about the Mongols use different words for different things. Like a person that's in charge of 10 soldiers and 100 and 1,000 has a different term for each of them. And it's not an English word, obviously. So if I start putting those in and a bunch of other terms, it's like someone running the hurdles, and the story is them running down the track. Every time I put another hurdle in place, it slows them down. And I've taken some of the terms, so like some of the soldiers are called, captain, lieutenant, general, and things like that, because it's more familiar. So I read a whole bunch of stuff, and then I kind of didn't use certain details, but other things I've trickled in there that hopefully people get a feeling and they understand enough of what I've introduced, in addition to all of the things that I'm trying to weave in about the culture and the society and the people.
Brilliant. That sounds really good. So, but this is a bit of a left field historical question from Max, another one of our members. He's just curious. So, from the research you've done, obviously, you said you've read the historical sources. What do you think was the most significant factors that led to the collapse of the Mongol Empire? Quite a big open-ended question.
That's a big
really,
question.
Yeah,
it's a big question.
That's a dissertation question, but see if we can.
It is 1,000 words. Explain how.
Yeah.
I think it like many of the empires that came before them, they fall apart for a number of reasons. One is the size. Something gets so vast that managing it, unless you were doing it in a modern era, is extremely difficult. For speed of communications is one thing, because Roman roads are famous. Mongol transport roads and the Silk Road and communication is also famous for the speed that a message could travel on horseback. That a messenger would take a horse, ride to the next post so many miles away, dump the horse, get a fresh one, and carry on. But you think about how long that would take to get across the empire. That's still a huge amount of time compared to modern standards. I think because there are so many descendants of Genghis Khan, all of them were fighting in some ways for the claim to the throne and claim to be the great Khan. That caused a lot of infighting. There's mention of 2 civil wars in my book, and there are a number of other ones going on all of the time. There's the fact that all of the countries they've invaded and occupied and taken over, while they folded in some of their soldiers to fight for them, there's still a huge chunk of the population that's not really happy that they've been invaded and taken over. And so you have all these people fighting for freedom at the same time in rebellion. So I think all of these factors combined just helped it, start to come apart at the seams. And then there are other enemies that are on the outside looking in, thinking, well, we want some of that territory, and we want some of that territory. And Europe and the Crusades, and North Africa with the Mamluks, and other countries just starting to come into the picture. And I think they stretched too far, faster than that's the other thing as well. Yeah. Like they tried to invade Japan twice and it failed twice because they weren't prepared and it weren't ready, and the storm came up and sank a whole bunch of their ships and all these kind of things. So yeah, there's my 1,000-word essay answer, Max.
No, it's good. I think it's the inevitable ending of most empires is that they collapse under their own weight. They stretch too far, and they just can't handle it. Whether it's because of infighting, it breeds civil war because there's too much to control. So we move past the historics for a moment. Obviously, there's magic in the story as well. It's not just historical fiction. It starts off very subtle, the level of magic. So you can almost believe it's a full-blown historical fiction book until you get certain part of the way in. How did you decide on the sort of presence you wanted magic to have in the balance between a normal fiction book and a fantasy book?
I've done 8 books before this one. The first 6 have mage in the title, so that gives you quite a good indication of the fact of the level of magic in those books. It was very overt, very bombastic. The Quest for Heroes duology, which I did before this, The Coward and the Warrior, has some magic but not a lot. So I wanted to do something different again with this series. So although magic is present, it's not a large portion of the story, and it will remain one of the characters, his story, and connected to his story, but it doesn't take over the story, because if it did, it would change the course of history radically. And my book kind of dances between the raindrops of history while still telling its own story. So I wanted to include magic, something that would feel fairly realistic. And the idea came from something that's factual that no longer exists. And I spun that off into what if? And that's where the magic came from. Even the structure of the magic and some of the other things have come from fact. So although magic is a part of the story, the fictional and the fantasy parts are some of the events, some of the politics, the people, the espionage stuff, and some of the other aspects are more of the fantastic in some ways. There is a little bit of magic, yeah, but it's not a big thing. You're not going to have massive wizard battles. I've done that. I've done that for 6 books. Go and read them if you want that. You know.
No, I think it's a good balance. Yeah. So this is Max again now. So I don't think it's quite as bad, this question.
Okay, good. Phew, not a 1,000-word essay this time. Okay.
So the character Temujin. So was he an actual person? He said that he couldn't find a record of him. He said it was the birth name of Genghis Khan.
Correct.
But couldn't find a son of Halugu. And if it's not a real person, why did you choose to create him rather than use an existing person in history?
So he's right, yes. That he, at one point in the story, Halagu says, "You're named after your grandfather," and you're basically a massive letdown. And he is to his dad in many ways. Because I create some completely carte blanche, because there are a number of characters that were mentioned occasionally that are real sons and daughters of Halagu Khan, who did to go on to do great things. So by creating someone completely fictional who fit within that space, I could do whatever I wanted without having to worry too much about history, because I'm already doing a lot of that already with the events. Some of the other characters are real. Some of the other kings and queens that you meet, some of the generals are real people. And so there's a lot of kind of framework and structure I've built into the story that I can't ignore because it's a part of history, and I don't want to move things too much. In some way, the story does veer away from history, and it's like one of those tankers. It takes so many miles for it to turn it so slowly, and that's kind of what I'm doing in this trilogy. I'm not going to say at the end of the 3rd book, massive mage battles, but I'm gradually moving the course of the story away from history as more of the fictional parts trickle in. And so by creating a fictional son, I could kind of do whatever I wanted with him, and I wasn't as constrained as I am with some of the other things to do with transport, culture, history, events, and some of the actual factual characters that I'm using.
And a follow-on question, I guess, is the House of Grace. Sort of the same question with that. Was that based on a particular group, or was there an inspiration behind that for the name and the group?
So because the House of Strength is real, and that's only for men at the time. It's changed more recently, in very recent times. Some women are now getting involved in it, and they can now enter them, they can do things. But at the time, in the 13th century, it was a purely a thing for men. And I thought, given the role that women have and how outspoken and how passionate Persian women are, then would be, I think, something an equivalent. But because of the way society worked then, and there was no gender equality that we have today, it would be very, very different. So it would be secretive. And so I just started to think about what it would be and how it would come to pass. And based upon my own experiences and knowledge of martial arts and other things, these things kind of click together. But I wanted to make it more than just spies. I wanted it to be other things in there. And one of the characters kind of says to someone, killing is the last resort. We do other things as well. And so I gradually trickle in the scope of what they do and the scale, so that you understand that it's not just one thing, it's many things.
Okay, cool. And who was your favorite character to write during the book? So I think the journeys and challenge, a big and a difficult question, but I think the journeys and challenges of Koko-chin and Kayvon, I think that what they face, that's some of my favorite parts of the book. But I would be interested to hear if you have a preferred character.
It's a bit of a Sophie's choice, really, asking me that. Like someone says, what's your favorite character of all your books? I'm like, I don't know, the one I'm writing at the moment. I think the most challenging person to write in the book was Halagu Khan, because I wanted him to feel realistic. He's based on a real person, but equally, for all of the horrible, horrible things that he did, he was also a human being. So I had to try and make him feel human, feel realistic, give him compassion, empathy in certain circumstances, but in other circumstances, he's really not a nice person. Koko-chin, because of what we know from history, is very little, that she effectively died. And so that was a big blank hole. And there again, I could invent a lot of stuff. Hers was the most interesting, and probably Temujin's, because I had more flexibility. I could invent a lot more things and decide upon their path Kayvon's was tied so closely to Hulagu Khan's, his story, that it was difficult sometimes to separate the two. So I think Kokachin's, because I was inventing so much stuff to do with her story and her past and what would happen to her, and the same with Temujin. I had this great idea and I built upon it with him and developed it. And I think they have probably some of the best arcs in the story and in the whole trilogy, I think. So they were probably the most interesting for me to write.
Do you ever put them in situations that you didn't intend to, that suddenly they're in a, lying bloody on the ground and they weren't supposed to be, or you feel bad and you have to backtrack a bit, or is it do they all go where they're supposed to? And
I plan my books fairly detailed. Occasionally something will crop up in a scene that I've not expected, and then I'll kind of sit back and look at it and think, what's that? And it's the case of, do I run with it or do I take it out? And occasionally I'll leave the thing in, run with it and see where it goes. And if I get to the end of the kind of writing session of that scene, I'm not happy with it, I'll take it out. But most of the time, I knew where all the characters were going. I introduced a couple of other points of view that occasionally I touch on in the book. And there again, I didn't always know what was going to happen with them. I knew I had to do a certain type of scene, but I wasn't sure what it was until I got into it. So those were the most unpredictable parts to write for me. The rest was, okay, now it's Kokachin chapter, right? I know what's happening next and I'll crack on and write her chapter. So the ones where I hadn't planned it in as much detail, I think, were the most surprising.
Okay. You might have answered this next one already, but I'll ask it anyway. So without spoiling anything too much, whose journey or story are you looking forward to writing more of and evolving more in the next books? If you haven't already written them, of course.
Well, I am 2/3 of the way through writing book 3 now.
Oh, that's good to hear.
So it'll be handed in at Christmas. And then I'm done. It'll just be edits on 2 and 3 after that. The most interesting, I think, is probably Temujin and Kokachin again. Probably Temujin's over the course of the series. Temujin goes through a lot of changes, some of which you've seen in the first book, and that continues across the course of the series. And Kokachin also transforms quite a lot in that first book, from where she begins to where she ends up at the end of it. And so it's what happens next for her is quite interesting. I really enjoy doing that because it's not set up, but I've taken on quite a journey in this first book. I'm like, right, now that we got to this place, what does that mean for her next adventure? What is she doing next? How is it going to affect her? Because she's not the same person she was at the beginning of the first book. So I think they were probably the most interesting ones, I think, again, yeah.
And you mentioned the historical timeline. Are you going to stick to the main events that happen in that timeline? Obviously, the magic developing more will naturally introduce more variables for you to contend with as you're writing. But will you completely veer off the timeline, as you said earlier? Or will the main events still be happening that happened in real time?
Some of them do, yes, but because I'm compressing time in terms of the years in events that happen, it's not a spoiler, it's historic fact. There's a later civil war that comes up, and it's several years after the story is set. I've had to kind of move that forward and talk about it in the books, in the series, because it's still relevant to the story and what's going on. Some of the other main tentpole events that in the books 2 and 3 I touch on, but by the time we get to the third book, things are quite different to history in terms of this event should happen, then it won't happen because I can't. The story's now changed, or I can't jump 5 years or 10 years. So the history aspects will still be there, but there'll be less of them. I'll be less restricted by them in books 2 and in particularly in book 3.
Okay. When can we expect the next one? It's one of the big questions. As I said, I was fortunate enough to have an arc at the start of the year, but I was also unfortunate enough because I've got to wait 6 extra months for the next one.
Well, it's July next year. It'll be out.
Okay.
So 1 book a year for the next 3 years. Yeah, July 2024 for the second book and July 2025 for book 3.
No, that's not bad at all. I can maybe hold off till then. Although it's only just July this year, isn't it? So
yeah, so you got a year to wait till book 2.
A year to wait.
So there you go.
I can have a reread later.
That's all right. Yeah.
Are there any other historical events or timelines that you want to write about with those? Not just purely historical fiction, but introducing those elements of fantasy and magic.
it's whether or not I revisit this part of the world. I think that's the most interesting thing for me, is whether I jump forward or I go further back, whether I go to a period when the Persian Empire, as it was, a lot more widespread. How far back do I go, when they were invading India in like 3000 BC, or I could go that far back. So it's a case of, if this does well and people are interested in stories set within this part of the world, maybe I could do folklore stories based upon that part of the world. We've seen a lot more reimagining of those, of fairy tales and folklore. It could be something that I do to do with this, because there again, they'd be unfamiliar. There are certain threads that connect mythology, like Hercules or Heracles, the Roman and Greek hero, has a connection in some ways to a Persian folk hero called Rustam, who has 7 challenges that he did, as opposed to the 10 of Hercules. So there's things like that I could do stories about, and retellings, and kind of modernize them in some ways, that interest me. So I might do something like that. I might do something later on in Persia, but right now I'm planning to do something very different first, bit of a palate cleanser, and then we'll see. Well, then we'll see where I am after that, if I come back to doing more historical fantasy.
Any hints on the next thing, or is that under wraps for now?
It's under wraps. I've got a number of pitches in place that are more kind of standalone in origin, and I'll be talking to my agent and my editor about those in the next few months, and see, for a bit of a change of pace and something different, and then we'll see what happens after that.
Oh, cool. Very nice. Do you ever envisage any of your books in a different kind of media, like a film, TV adaptation, or a game adaptation? Is there any that you'd prefer them to see them as?
I'd love to see this done as a TV series, for sure, with the popularity of things like, Game of Thrones, and having something that's so complex, and political wranglings, and the nature of the system, and armies and wars. I think it would work really, really well. So doing like The Last Kingdom, 8-10 episodes a season, 5 seasons of that, something like that, I think would be fantastic. I don't have any cast in mind. I don't have any, think, who would you be for that? Like, I've no idea. It's almost better if it's an unknown, because then you're not constantly referring them to, oh, he was good in that, or I've seen him in this. And I think they did very well with that in Game of Thrones for the most part. You weren't going, oh, that's so and so. It's like, no, that's Littlefinger, and that's all I know him as. Let's what of Viserys, or whoever it might be.
Yeah, absolutely. I know the Winter King series is coming out soon as well. This actually gave me Winter King vibes when I was reading it. The battle scenes and stuff reminded me very much of the Winter King. So he's getting all his books made into TV series at the moment. So that's
my favorite series. The Winter King trilogy is my favorite series of his. So I'm really excited and looking forward to seeing that.
Yes, it's definitely a favorite. It's what I say to people when I recommend Judas Blossom, is that if you liked Winter King, give Judas Blossom a go, because it's
excellent.
The historical fiction element is very similar, but there's just a dash of magic in there. So if you like fantasy more than historical fiction, it'll also appeal to you as well. Very, very nice. I've completely forgotten what I was going to ask next. Went off on a tangent there, and I see you got a lot of books behind you. Do you have any favorite recommendations that you usually give out to readers?
Oh god, so some good books I've read recently. You're talking about King Arthur there, obviously, with the Winter King. Have you read By Force Alone by Lavi Tidhar?
I haven't, no, but I'll write it down as we're talking.
Okay, so I'll pull it off a shelf here. It is Head of Zeus by Force Alone. It's one of 4 retellings-ish that he's doing. And there's some stuff in here that's completely weird and impossible and never actually happened, and totally made up and totally ridiculous. However, in the back of the book, he talks about how the rest of it is probably the most historically accurate version you'll find of King Arthur, because the sources that he pulled on are before the romanticized stories that were used in like the 1800s and 1700s in France and other places, that then spread into England. So in terms of history, probably some of it, not all of it, clearly, is more accurate than you'd imagine. And the brutality and the way it's absolutely fantastic. So he's done that one. He's done a Robin Hood one, which I've got on my to read pile, and he's doing 2 more, but we don't know what they are. So I always recommend them. I'm currently reading Empire of Silence by Christopher Rocchio.
Another one of my favorites.
It's amazing.
Yeah,
I've had it for a
absolutely
while. I've been dying to read it. I kept saying, oh yeah, I'll get to it and get to it. I absolutely love it. I've already ordered book 2. Can't wait to get into it. I followed him anyway on YouTube and watch his stuff, and now he's announced it's going to be 7 books instead of 6, so that's fantastic. Really excited about
not
that.
for the wallet, but yeah. I've got all the first edition hardbacks of the Empire of Silence, the Sun Eater. They're incredible books. We interviewed him on the channel a while back. And he's incredibly knowledgeable and stuff he uses, and the way he plays off. He makes deliberate mistakes in the books as well. So the modern day people there misuse the old Roman terms and stuff when they talk about centurions and things like that. They misuse them deliberately.
Yeah,
he says people contact him and people say, you've used this the wrong way, and he said, no, I did that on purpose.
To show how far they've come from Earth. They don't remember their own history, and they can't even remember certain things, and they keep talking about it. Yeah, he's very good at that. So that's what I've read recently. I'm trying to think what else I've read. Anthony Ryan, I'm really enjoying his A Covenant of Steel trilogy. I've just read the Martyr and the first one I can't remember, but the new one's
the P, doesn't it? The
Pariah, is it Pariah? And
the
Martyr.
The Pariah,
and then the third book, The Traitor, comes out 11th of July as well, so I'll be picking up that. Really, I think it's his best series yet, but that's just my opinion. The rest of his books are still fantastic. Blood Song and other things. Those are probably what I've read recently that I've really enjoyed.
Some good recommendations. There's some of my favorites in there, so that's good.
But yeah, Lavi Tudor.
Yeah, and that's going to be added to the list. That one by Force Lane. Brilliant. So I think we're coming to the end there.
Cool.
Thanks for coming on, talking about the new book. It's been brilliant. We'll definitely get you back on, talk about when the next one comes out, because I'm going to want to talk more about it, and maybe we'll do a spoilered interview as well. So
I did this with someone else, and they were like, "Can we do a spoiler one later?" And I'm like, "Yeah, give it a few months," because they want to ask me about a bunch of things. We have to keep saying when this. Oh, you can't say that. The thing with the thing. Yeah. So it made no sense.
That's it. So what we're going for now, we're going to go for shorter interviews, focus just on what you've done recently, and then we'll dive into spoilery things when you do the next one, because people have had the chance to read it, then it's their own fault.
I think that's fair. I think that's fair. You give them a chance to read it and talk about it afterwards. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Cool.
So thank you everyone for joining us. As I've been talking to Stephen Aryan, author of The Judas Blossom. I'll show it one more time. Incredible book, one of my favorites this year, so definitely go pick it up. If you've been watching this, you can get a gist about what it's about, kind of influences that are playing in there. If you want to see more of our stuff, more of our content, then check out our socials. They'll be coming up at the bottom of the screen, and they'll also be in the description of this video. Once again, Stephen, thank you very much for joining us, and I hope to talk to you again soon.
Definitely.